When you jump out of a building from the 100th floor, everything is pretty good right up until about the 99th floor and, just before you hit the ground. The first fact, which is unacknowledged by many, is that we're spending too much. This is a chart of using 2005 dollars, and it's billions of dollars, the way that the government is spending. The actual numbers matter less than the overall trajectory, which you can see is incredibly high. We're spending a lot of money. This is total government spending. It's a different before this is federal spending in 2005 dollars over basically the 21st century, and you can see things are up about 50% in absolute terms. This is total government spending, local, state, and federal government as a share of GDP. The big spike towards the, I guess it would be your left of the chart, that's World War II, and you can see we're coming down a little bit, but when you factor in all this, we're spending a hell of a lot of money. And that, when I said it's an unacknowledged fact, that's because we have dissenters or discontents about this who include Barack Obama, who recently told John Boehner that we don't have a spending problem. And of course, Boehner is not a particularly reliable source. Unfortunately, this is a guy who, I live part-time in Ohio, and John Boehner is actually my congressman, but a couple of weeks before he became Speaker of the House in 2011, he was asked by NBC News to, could you say that we're spending too much money, could you name a program that should be cut? And he actually said on national news, I really can't think of anything off the top of my head. So it's like, but in any case, so some people say we're not spending too much. We don't have a spending problem. Jonathan Chait, a writer at New York Magazine, who Matt and I and various other recent contributors wrangle with all the time online, he says there really isn't money to be cut everywhere. And then there's a kind of tell-all, and Matt has a great editorial in the second, or the next to most recent issue, about people who talk like this, but there's a regular construction that you will see again and again if you read the Beltway press, which is, we don't have a spending problem. What we have is a healthcare problem or a defense problem or an aging problem or, sunspots. That's the problem, but it's never spending. So that's an unacknowledged and unavoidable fact. Another unacknowledged and unavoidable and disturbing fact is that we've got too much debt. This is gross public debt, so that includes public debt held by the public in terms of bonds and things like that, as well as all of the money that the government owes to itself. So when the government takes the money out of the Social Security Trust Fund and spends it elsewhere and puts an IOU in there, this is all in that. And again, this is in absolute dollars or constant dollars. This is in percentage of GDP, but you can see where we've gone from starting at the 21st century, which, by the way, I don't know about any of you who grew up in the 20th century, but the 21st century was supposed to be pretty cool, and it really is not turning out quite the way that we envisioned. There's no jetpacks, there's no dog walks out on the side of your hover pod or anything like that from the Jetsons, but in 2000, debt as a percentage of GDP was about 55%. Now it's over 100% of GDP. This is gross public debt for state and local governments, and you can see something similar happened there. It's smaller, but it started at about 15% of GDP, and it got up to about 20%, and it's crested down a little bit because states basically used a lot of the stimulus money that they got to pay down some of their debt. It did not, as I think most of us understand, did not stimulate the economy quite the way as it was intended. And yet here you have more discontents talking about this. Larry Summers, who some of you, is anybody from Harvard here? Okay, I'll speak slower. But Larry Summers, governments that enjoy such low borrowing costs can improve their creditworthiness by borrowing more, not less. And you wonder, how did we get in to this situation. It's just dumbfounding, isn't it? David Dine, a blogger at Firedog Lake, which is a left-wing site. We have a broad capacity to borrow loads of money at ultra-low rates. Government should capitalize on it. And then Paul Krugman, who some of you have heard of, constantly is talking about, well, look, if the theory that he's presupposing is that if the government was borrowing so much, it would crowd out money for private investment and interest rates would go up. Interest rates are not going up, so that we have not borrowed enough money, where we can keep borrowing and keep borrowing. And this is the type of, this type of thing that, it sounds like these guys are mafia loan sharks. Don't worry, you'll be able to pay it back. You'll be able to pay it out. Why don't you take out more money? But here is the third fact, which is that debt overhang kills growth, and it doesn't necessarily show up in interest rates. This is the idea of debt overhang comes from a recent work by the economists Carmen and Vincent Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff. And Carmen Reinhardt and Kenneth Rogoff also wrote an excellent book recently about financial crises over centuries. But they define debt overhang as moments when the gross public debt to GDP ratio is greater than 90% for at least 5 years. We're in that, according to their understanding of things. Debt overhang episodes, these periods of 5 years or more, are associated with growth over 1% lower than during other periods. So when your debt to GDP ratio gets above 90% for a period of time, it lowers economic growth for a long time. They looked at 26 cases going back over the past couple hundred years. The average duration of reduced growth is about 23 years, so that for 23 years you have average growth that is going to be 1% or more less than it would have been absent that much debt. Then they also, and I'll just summarize this, but that basically what they said is that this is true even when interest rates don't spike up, which is a kind of conventional or traditional understanding of the way that economic forces would work. And what this means, this is a figure, a table or a chart rather, which shows what that really means to say that, okay, if you have a debt overhang period, this is how much economic growth suffers as a result. And without the debt overhang is the blue line up there, and you can see just over a 23, 24-year period, a quarter of a century, a generation, for God's sake, you would start at 100 and you would be up above 220 if you have the reduced growth rate. It's the red line down there below. And think of that slice between those two lines as all of the jobs that are missing, all of the forward momentum, all of the college, all of the education, all of the improvement, all of the unemployment, all of the wasted human capital and lives. That's what's coming, because we're in that, and it's not clear exactly how you get out of that so quickly. So now that we've gone through some bad news, I want to talk about some, again, surprising facts. One thing that is particularly interesting is that, and I think this is a minor sign of hope, which is that real per capita GDP spending by the federal government has been flat. This is a chart put together by Veronique de Rougy, an economist at the Mercatus Center. She's also a Reason columnist, and I had actually asked her a while ago to do this, which what this does is it looks at per capita using inflation-adjusted dollars, real dollars, per capita. What are the spending patterns over the past 35, 40 years? And what shows here, which is pretty interesting, is that there's a reliable trend, which is that under Democratic presidents, spending tends to be relatively flat. Real spending, when you adjust for inflation and population, tends to be flat, and the growth periods come under Republican presidents. And certainly, if you look at the second George W. Bush, that was very much the case. And even when you see Obama, there's that big jump up. Even part of that spending is due to George Bush and the late in his final term, things like the TARP bailout and whatnot. Some of that was sloughed into 2009 spending, which then got goosed even more by things like Obama's stimulus and whatnot. But this, I would argue, is a good sign. I mean, it's awful that we have this, ziggurat of doom going up here, but there's every reason to believe that Obama or the country is not going to be able to actually increase spending in the near term very much. I mean, we have to fight on this, but people are starting to understand more and more what's going on, and partly because they're understanding that spending growth is being driven by entitlement spending. That this is which is something that people don't fully understand most of the time. But this is data that was put together by Nate Silver of the New York Times. He runs the 538 blog there, and he cuts and slices data in lots of interesting ways. But and he's a kind of conventional liberal, and when he looked at this is the type of thing that Reason has been reporting for 10 years, 20 years. When somebody in the New York Times says it's news, but what he found was that you look at annualized growth rates from 1972 through 2011, and you can see entitlement programs growing by almost 5% a year. Infrastructure and services went up by about 3%. Defense 2%, interest 3.4%, and boy, we're going to get slammed when interest rates do go up. They are historically low, and that will not hold forever. But total government spending over that period went up by 3.4%, again, driven mostly by entitlement programs. GDP less than 3%, and that's a big part of our problem, is that when you have spending that's growing faster than the economy, you start getting into a situation where government spending keeps growing, but the economy doesn't. Now, what Silver said, though, and what's interesting, and this goes back to an earlier chart, what he noticed, though, is that when you think about it in terms of entitlement spending, that's the big shift, and that's the blue part down here, and you can see the blue part is what's growing. Up through, really 1960, entitlement spending wasn't that big a deal. There was basically only Social Security and some welfare payments. By 1970, Medicare and Medicaid had come fully online, and then, and what's interesting about this chart is that this doesn't count Obamacare coming on, and it doesn't count massive increases in Medicare in particular that are coming very quickly. But basically, the role of the federal government has shifted from being one of doing infrastructure and services and defense to becoming what he said is an insurance broker. And he looked at the fact that since the early 70s, trust and confidence in government had been going down at the very same time that government spending had shifted dramatically towards entitlement or to social insurance. And he noted in his piece, most of us don't care much for our insurance broker, which I take as a good sign. Because we don't care for our insurance broker, and so we're less likely to do business with them. We don't trust the government very much. This is a Gallup poll that was taken last fall, and the dark green line is people who think that the government most of the time, can you trust the government in Washington to do what is right? The dark green line are the people, I think they're colloquially known as suckers. They are people who think the government is trying to do the best they can or does a pretty good job most of the time. It's dropping. It's down at 19% now, whereas the people who are more skeptical of government power and government's ability to address all the ills in the world is rising. And that's a good thing because these are preconditions to how we get out of the situation we're in.